Hello everyone, welcome back into the studio. My name is Eirik and this is Dynamic Figure Fusion Part 2. In this video series, we're focusing on how you can sculpt using the major bony masses of the body as your building blocks to construct on top of, letting you choose a pose that no model can hold and then observe different parts of the model separately from each other and put it all together. Sculpting like this lets you take control of the entire process and not simply be a slave to what the model can do for you. Let's get into it. We're working towards the top of the ribcage currently. There are two major landmarks up there, which we really need to get placed right. Number one consideration is of course the ribcage itself. Does it have the proper dimensions? Is it tall enough, for example? When dealing with complex poses like this, I have a series of measurements from the model I intend to use already taken. She can't take the pose that my sculpture is in, but her ribcage shouldn't become longer or shorter by any margin really, no matter what pose she's in. It's mostly the width of the ribcage that changes when we breathe, of course, and we do have the sternum, which is a solid bone, which is a length, which we can use to measure from and compare to other non-changing measurements. The width of the ACES points on the pelvis won't change, for example, so how does the length of the sternum compare to the width of ACES to ACES? This is a good question to ask yourself. At the very top of the ribcage, we have two landmarks which I'd like to find and place accurately before moving on from the bony masses here. We have the pit of the neck, which I'll call the PON from here on, that's in the front, and we have the C7 vertebra in the back, which is a nice visual landmark at the top of the ribcage in the back. It's usually very visible as this little bump on the surface, right where the trapezius muscle of the neck creates this sort of connecting arc from one side to the other. Since the depth of the ribcage can't significantly be changed no matter what we do, we actually measure this distance on our model and represent it faithfully right here on our sculpture in this moment. This will help us set the depth of the ribcage at the top, which often gets misunderstood, and for sculpting a head it will help set one of the dimensions we need for the neck, of course, the depth dimension that is. Notice the angle between the PON and the C7. They do not sit directly across from each other in the anatomical pose. And we of course don't have the anatomical pose here, of course, the anatomical pose being a T-pose more or less, but there is still going to be an angle between the two. The ribcage ends higher in the back than it does in the front. We have this expression at the Florence Academy where I work, and it's an expression where we call something common sense clay. This means simply that there are places in your sculpture where the clay will need to be eventually, and so there's no right or wrong time to really begin moving the correct direction, moving into the correct direction, and filling some of those spaces in a little bit. This does a few things for us. It creates a more recognizable figure, which we will then have an easier time making good decisions about. It also means that when we do start working out more accurately the areas where we've placed some common sense clay, we will have an easier time doing so and less clay will need to be piled on in order for us to represent what we're after representing. Essentially, it'll be a little bit quicker to reach the surface. Now we're going to perform a little jump in time. What we've jumped over here is the beginning of the building of the contours. Contours are simple enough. Contours mean the outline of the body. We continue to observe the contours in the same way we've observed the bony masses of the body so far. If we're looking to work on contours around the pelvis, then we're going to work with the pelvis as our observational truth. If we're working on contours around the ribcage, then we'll work with the ribcage as our observational truth. And how we do that we covered in the first video in this series. It gets more complex as we expand outwards from the core of the body towards the limbs. The limbs will be observed individually as well when it makes sense to do so. And so the question to ask yourself is, when does it make sense to do so? When there is foreshortening that we need to get rid of, to observe truthfully is the answer. If such is the case, then we'll look to find a different set of foreviews for an individual part. There is another great benefit to having the bony masses well positioned and well proportioned at this point. It will set you free and speed up a lot of your decision making when it comes to contours, because where the contour needs to go has already been worked out to a certain extent. The contour for the abdomen, for example, it can only go in one place, which is inside the opening at the front of the ribcage and attached to the bottom of the front of the pelvis. By having the bony masses well dealt with here, the abdomen will, by default, be well dealt with as well. Now we simply have to observe it carefully so we can capture how it looks, of course. But the more difficult part of proportion and position is already more or less dealt with. Since I have a good idea of where the bottom of the sternum is on my figure, I can very easily use it to confirm the placement of the breast against. Are they higher or lower than the bottom of the sternum is a question that I might ask myself. At this point, this is an easy question to answer. Since I have the bottom of the ribcage established on the flanks, I have the space the obliques will need to occupy already established, and therefore placing them is not a very difficult task. While not entirely true, doing things the way I have here leaves us in a place where it's a lot like fitting puzzle pieces into an already half-built puzzle. The pieces can only really fit properly where they are meant to fit. Can there be issues and discrepancies? Of course there can. But ideally the box and egg setup was done accurately enough that what I'm doing here will fall into place okay for now as well. Okay for now simply means accurate enough for where we're at in the process. Perhaps not accurate enough for a final result, but accurate enough to where I can do this, feel okay about it, and move it and improve it slightly. I try to tell our students all the time, accuracy is accumulative, which just means it doesn't happen all at once. It's something we're building towards, and the process facilitates that building. We're accurate enough for now. We'll get more accurate as we progress and hone things into place. Since sculpting is hard, we like to make it easier for ourselves by using a few tricks. Symmetry across the center line is one of those tricks, and it works on 3 levels. First and foremost, there is symmetry in width. On either side of the center line, there is symmetry in width. One side of the ribcage is not wider than the other, and the same thing is of course true for the pelvis, and the same thing is of course true for the skull, which is the last of the bony masses. There are some areas where you might find slight deviations to this formula, but in general, within a bony mass, there is symmetry in the overall width on either side of the center line. We have symmetry in the angle breaks in the contour on either side of the center line as well. This simply means that if we find one angle break in the contour on one side of the body, we should look for the same thing on the other side of the body, and we're very likely going to find it. Not always the exact same angle break, not always the exact same thing, but something very similar that is reminiscent of what happened on the other side. This is of course because 90 degrees to the center line traveling through a bony mass, we have the same forms on either side of the center line, because our muscles are attached to the bones symmetrically, which means that any angle break on one side should be echoed on the other. This brings me to the final point, which is that the internal information, not only the contour, but the internal information, is also symmetrical on either side of the center line. We have the same muscles attached on either side of the center line, and therefore we should have symmetry more or less. You can't move an insertion or an origin point of a muscle, so no matter the movement of the body, there should be symmetry in how muscles are attached on either side of the center line. There are of course exceptions to these rules. In an area like between the ribcage and the pelvis, which is sort of like the accordion section of the body, you're not always going to find symmetry, and you're not always going to find equal width. You're not always going to find symmetry in length of a muscle either, when one side is stretched and the other is compressed. But this should be accounted for when you build the box and the egg, as the muscles are stretched or compressed based on where the origin and insertion points are in relationship to each other. If the pelvis and ribcage is further apart on one side because we have a contrapposto pose, the oblique still fills the same space and attaches in the same place on either side, except now it's been stretched a bit longer to cover a greater distance because of the way the bony masses are positioned. The shoulder blades can also create a host of issues with symmetry since they move independently of each other. But the concept of symmetry is still a very valuable resource which will take out a lot of guesswork. If you no longer need to observe the obvious, because you happen to know the obvious, of course, then you can spend energy observing things on a different level, a deeper level, and create work which surpasses the superficial observations that a beginner might have to spend a lot of time making.